100 people have been killed in Gaza this week as Israel and Hamas bombard each other with bombs and rockets. But social media is becoming an increasingly important weapon in the arsenal of insurgents and governments fighting conflicts all over the world. From Israel to Iraq, wars are being fought not only on the ground but also in the Twitter sphere. Sarah Head reports.
It's been a week of fear and destruction across Israel and Palestine. The death toll from Israeli bombs in the Gaza Strip has hit 100, while Palestinian rockets have rained down on 14 towns across Israel. But it being 2014, having to head for bomb shelters does not prevent civilians from reaching for their mobile phones to share their experiences. In such a polarizing conflict, supporters of both sides know the value of social media when it comes to winning the battle for hearts and minds. Gaza was the second biggest trending tweet across the Middle East this week. Today, 4 of the 10 top trending tweets worldwide are about the conflict. Supporters of the Palestinians use hashtags such as Gaza under fire to spread images of the destruction. While Israel's PR machine has also embraced social media, tweeting cartoons about Hamas's interpretation of a bomb shelter and broadcasting a daily rocket count to its 250,000 followers. Around the globe, insurgents are using social media to spread their message. The ISIS insurgents battling the Iraqi government may practice a 7th century fundamentalist version of Islam, but they've shown modern sophistication when it comes to social media. From their slickly produced jihad videos to hijacking World Cup hashtags to spread propaganda to football fans. ISIS has outfought the Iraqi government online as well as on the battlefield. Baghdad's response was to order Iraqi internet providers to block social media sites, but it hasn't stopped videos like this one spreading around the world. Nigeria's Boko Haram were one of the first insurgencies to use social media to spread their message. Even if their goal is a medieval caliphate where education is forbidden, they've proved adept at using 21st century tools. Analysts have complained that social media platforms don't do enough to combat extremists and shut down rogue Twitter accounts. But companies such as Facebook say it's difficult to police 1 billion users. Instead, opponents are left to fight fire with fire and create their own social media campaign to draw attention to their own cause. Sarah Head, Arise News.
Well, for more on that story, let's speak to Kevin Poulter. He's a social media expert and he joins us now here in the studio. I mean, that report really put it so totally into context. That's right. I mean, you know, people who living in the past but using the future as a tool, and how difficult it is to control.
That's right. It's incredibly difficult to control and difficult to regulate. The reality is, with over a billion users, Facebook can't take control of who's saying what and actually taking action to prevent those things from being said. So then it comes down to, and as we've seen before, it comes down to the users to do what they can to try and self-regulate these social media platforms. And we've seen it before with Twitter and the various reporting buttons that have now been introduced. But interestingly, action is being taken. There is now, I suppose, more of a need for Facebook and Twitter and all the social media sites to stand out and say, well, this isn't acceptable, it isn't part of our policy, we won't tolerate it, we now need to do something about it. But with so many users, where do you start?
And also, how do you decide who is, in inverted commas, a terrorist organisation and who isn't?
That's
I think
right.
What I find really interesting is, you know, as these armed groups use social media, they seem to be on the upswing of the trend, while governments, not perhaps in the case of the Israeli government in this one conflict, but in general they seem to be lagging behind.
That's right. It's still a relatively new medium. It's still a new format. And unlike the traditional media, which was much easier to censor, this is just, it's instant messaging. It's instant, videos can be uploaded to YouTube almost instantly. The checks don't take place. They don't happen until it's reported or until much later, when there could be hundreds or thousands or even millions of viewers, and the message has already been done. And then when you talk about censorship, which is in reality is where the regulation takes place, whether it's government endorsed or whether it's introduced by these social media platforms themselves, it's still a form of censorship. Where's the freedom of speech? And an action such as blocking access to social media sites actually can cause more damage and cause more unrest within these communities.
Indeed, that was what was happening in Myanmar or Burma, where the sort of anti-Muslim postings on Facebook, and they blocked it.
Yeah.
But then it just goes elsewhere.
It's right, and we've seen it. You block one site, and something else grows up in its place. And
it's like a hydra, isn't it?
Really, and it's the access that people have now to smartphones, as we've heard, to cheaper phones as well. In Myanmar, particularly, I think 2 years ago, only 1% of the population had access to the internet. In a few years' time, it's expected that half of the population will then have access to cheap mobile phones, to the internet, and to be able to coordinate what are really very sophisticated strategies which are being deployed to spread these messages immediately.
And it's interesting also that if we take ISIS as an example, what they're putting out in video terms is actually reasonable quality. It's watchable to a degree, which must be part of the strategy. But talking to John Cookson, our correspondent, earlier, he was telling us that, you know, outside the mosques they're handing out these DVDs of executions, but yet the most recent videos ISIS have put out online are them jumping around and playing in a river and handing out candy floss to kids. So it seems to me that they can have this top line sort of image, and then they can have the one on the ground and get away with presenting both faces.
That's right. It's propaganda. It's very
sort of narrowcasting and broadcasting.
Yes.
Absolutely, and people are engaging with it, and I think that's the real concern. And sometimes the statistics are skewed when you see the figures that are talked about on social media. Often there are talking about hundreds of thousands or millions. In reality, they're not necessarily local community views or listeners or followers. That's around the world, and this is a global issue. And as we've seen, the worldwide trending, it's a global issue which people are interested in. It doesn't necessarily mean they're supporters, and I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as well.
Kevin, thank you very much. It's a fascinating subject.
It
Thank
certainly
you.
is.